friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using the Hello Bluebird Polar Friends stamp set. So I've stamped out my images with Lawn Fawn jet black ink on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock, and I'll be coloring with my Copic markers. So I'm trying a new combination for polar bears today. I'm using E40 and E41. If you've ever looked closely at a polar bear, and by closely I mean from a safe distance, either on the television or in photographs or at the zoo where there are guardrails in place, they usually have like a yellowish tinge to their coat. So I kind of went with these beige tones. I thought yellow might not translate well with Copics, but I wanted to do something other than like a gray. So I used the E40 and E41. I stuck really close to the artist drawn lines on the outside edge, so the majority of him does stay white, so he will hopefully read as white. And I think especially once I get all the blues that are going to go on in the background, it'll also really help them to pop and read as white. And I'm going to color the other polar bear exactly the same. I'm doing a central light source on today's card, and by that I mean that my light is actually going to be coming from the center. So the critters that are on the left and right, both of them will have the light on their faces and the shadows on their back. So I just kind of reverse it depending on which side of the card they're going to end up on. And I always like to do a little shadow right over the muzzle to just accentuate that, because I really think it makes them look extra cute. So now moving on to my penguins. I'm going to do them in warm grays. This is another reason I didn't want the polar bears to be in grays, because I was already going to have gray with the penguins. So I just wanted something a little bit different. So I'm using W3, W5, and W7 for those. And I'm going to lay in my shadows with the W7. This little guy that I'm working on now is going to end up on the left-hand side of the card. So again, his shadows are on the right-hand side, on the back of his body, and his light source, his highlight, will be on the front. And that's just a great way to keep their features highlighted, because the face is the most important part. It's where all the expression is. So I always like to keep the face as light as possible, and having that central light source helps with that, which is why I do it quite often in scene cards where I have a lot of different critters on various parts of the layout. So I just finished him by blending out that W5 and filling in with the W3, and now moving on to the other little guy. He is going to end up right in the center of the card, so his light source is a little bit different. I'm actually shading him just about equal on both the right hand side and the left. I'm trying to keep it as equal as I possibly can. I did have to move my marker caps over to make room for my hand, but I'm giving him that shading on both sides, and then also a little bit right above his beak to accentuate that area as well and help it look a little bit recessed in comparison to his beak, which would be protruding out a bit. So his shading is on the left and right, and also kind of the underside, so the bottom of his wings. And I'm keeping that area for the highlight at the top where the sun would be hitting the most. Also on the crown of his head, because the sun would be reflecting there as well. For the white parts of their body, I'm using W00 and W1. Just a very small amount of shading with that W1, and because I'm working so quickly and there's not much to do, I'm just going to do both of them at once, and then I will blend that out with the W00. I'm using a flicking motion and pressing down a little bit harder so that I get a little more ink that's going to break up the edge of that W1 and help that fade into the white areas. And then I will grab my colorless blender and soften that as well, just like I did with the polar bears. For the penguin's beaks and feet, I'm using YR04 and YR07. I started with the YR07 and added a little shadow, and then I'm going to blend that out with the YR04. I think these colors really work well together and don't require a lot of blending. And then I wanted to give all of my critters some rosy cheeks, so I pulled out R11 and R12. I also used the R12 to color in the inside of the bear's ears. So I did a little oval shape on each of their cheeks and 2 on the guy that's facing forward. And then I wanted to go around the edge of that with the R11, but for some reason it was looking a bit dark, so I decided to pull in the R00 instead. So I'm going around the edge of the R12 with that and helping that to kind of fade and look a bit more natural. For the Snowball, I'm using BG10 and BG11. So I used the BG11 first to put kind of a thicker shadow on there and then blended that out with the BG10. I wanted it to look really frosty, like when the snow starts to turn to ice and it just gets that kind of crispy texture to it. And again, I'm going to use my colorless blender to just help that fade into the white area. And then I'm going to start my accessories. So for the 2 penguins, I wanted them to have yellow scarves. So I'm using Y000, Y11, and Y13. And I'll be adding some detail to these in just a little bit, but I need this ink to dry first, so I'll have to come back to that. But the color combos on today's card are totally inspired by my childhood. When I was a kid, I absolutely loved to color, and my favorite combination to use on a scene in my coloring books was yellow and either aqua or periwinkle. I just loved yellow with either of those 2 blue shades, and I'm going to kind of combine all of those today, and man, it just felt so nostalgic. So the polar bear's scarf is going to be blue to kind of bridge the gap between the aqua and the periwinkle. So I'm using B000, B21, and B23. And again, I'm going to come back and add some more detail to this later, but that's why I wanted to keep it fairly light colored so that you could still see all of the difference that I'm going to be adding over top. So now that my yellow scarves have dried, I'm going to add in my detail using Y15. And on this guy, I'm going to do a plaid pattern. So I'm doing 1 stripe and then 2 stripes, 1 stripe and then 2 stripes, and then I reverse the direction. I have to say my nib on this one is kind of soft. I think maybe I need to replace it because I wasn't really able to get a super fine line, but anyway, I'll add some more detail with a white gel pen later to help emphasize that. And on the other little guy, I'm just doing yellow polka dots, and I think that showed up a lot better. I made sure to space them far enough apart so that they really stood out. On the polar bear, I wanted to do kind of like a different plaid pattern, so I'm starting with straight up and down stripes, all fairly equal distant. I wasn't too careful about it, but just kind of spacing them about equal to my eye. And then I'm going to turn my paper so I can get comfortable because I'm doing really teeny stripes. Thank goodness this one does have a nicer nib, so I'm able to add those really thin lines, and I'm using such a light hand, it's like I'm barely touching the paper with the tip of that nib. Those 2 things are kind of the key elements to achieving a super thin line. You want to have a very light hand, and you want to have like a nib that comes to a finer point. It's not like a special nib, it's the regular nib, but over time they get kind of worn down, so then you might need to replace it. So now I'm taking the white gel pen, like I mentioned, and just doing a little more of that plaid pattern over top, and I think that did help it stand out a bit more. And I will take a black gel pen and go over the polar bear's eyes, and then I'm going to trim these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I've taken the winter walk scene from Hello Bluebird and die cut that out of some more Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock. And I want to try Copic coloring the entire thing. So we're going to see how this goes. I'm going to work in sections, and I'm starting with the frame. I want that to stay white, but I kind of need to attach this now so that my elements all fit together as they need to, because it's kind of like putting together a puzzle, and you kind of need the outer pieces first. So it's that same concept. I need that frame on there in order to assemble it correctly. So if you would make an accident and get some of your Copic coloring on the frame, if it's not something that you can push back out with the colorless blender, you could always die cut a second white frame and adhere that over top. It wasn't necessary for me today, but it's always something that you could do if you run into that issue. So I'm starting from the bottom to the top, and I'm putting together my snowdrifts first, always kind of testing out the pieces and making sure I have them how they're going in order to fit them correctly so I don't get glue all over the place. I also have the die still there to kind of use as a guide, but you do have to keep in mind that the die is backwards, so you have to kind of flip all your pieces the other direction. I can't turn the die over because it doesn't have all the same detail on the back side. So I'm using my BG11 and BG10 to add some shading to my snowdrifts so that my snow matches the snow on my snowball. So I use those two shades, and then I'm going to grab my colorless blender again and go over the bottom edge of that so that it all looks nice and faded together and doesn't just like there's kind of stripes. So there you can see I did get a little bit of ink on the frame, but I was able to kind of push it away with my colorless blender. So this next section is where it starts to get a little bit more tricky. It's not too bad, but I have to fit all of the pieces together, and I can't glue anything down until they're all in place so that I know I have everything spaced correctly, because it would really stink to start adhering things down and then find out when you get to the edge that you've got some gaps or something. There's not really a way to fix that. I guess you probably could use a white card base underneath. I have used Lawn Fawn Dolphin cardstock, so I'd have a little bit of a light gray color underneath. But even if you did use a white card base, I still think that any gaps would be pretty noticeable just because of the extra layer of cardstock, that would be missing in that gap. So you want to make sure that everything is spaced and then start adhering things down. So how I'm doing this is I'm actually adhering all the pieces that go between the trees, but I'm not adhering the trees because I want to be able to pull those out so that I can color in my mountain range and not have to worry about getting that ink on those trees. So once I have all of those pieces fit together, I'm going to pull those trees back out, and then I can grab my Copics that I want to use for the mountains. And here is where I'm going to introduce the periwinkle. So I'm using B63 and B60. I'm starting with the B63, and I'm coloring in the top of the mountain, so they're going to get darker at the top and get lighter as they get down toward the bottom. I do have to be careful with the side pieces to not get that ink on the frame unless you're planning on, doing the extra frame like I mentioned. But I don't have to be careful with the tops or the sides of each of those other sections because, it's all going to get covered up. So I can just color straight over the edge and not have to worry about, stopping or having a look that doesn't kind of flow between each of the pieces. This is going to give me a much more consistent look, so it looks like one long mountain range in the distance once I get all the other elements put in there. I will say that my B60 was a little dry. I didn't know that it was, so that one is going on my list of refills for the next time I order. Otherwise, I think I would have been able to achieve a nicer blend, but I had to work with what I had. I'd already started with this combo and I didn't really have anything else comparable. These colors are pretty unique in the Copic spectrum. There's not really anything else that looks exactly like B60 that I'm aware of. Even like the lighter BVs or Vs, they have a little bit more of the purple tone as opposed to the blue tone in here. So I just went with it and continued to blend to the best of my ability. I did have to do a few layers, and I told myself it didn't really matter if the blend was perfect because these are supposed to be mountains, and mountains, you know, aren't smooth, they're rock. So the next thing I'm going to add is my snow caps on my mountains. And I will say it's kind of like a balance between making sure that you have enough glue on all of these pieces that none of the little parts stick up and kind of get caught and kind of ruin the look of, you know, the flat one layer panel. But you also don't want to have so much glue that it kind of squeezes out and gets all over the place. So just kind of be careful. Use something with a small nozzle so that it helps you kind of get that glue all around without getting too much of it. So I'm popping my 3 trees back into the panel so that I can fill in all the little bits of sky. And this is the most tricky part because you've got all of those little pieces that go between the tree branches. So I do recommend that when you die cut these that you kind of set them off in piles. I have one pile that went into the trees on the left, and then the other pile goes in the tree on the right, so that I didn't kind of have to worry too much about what went where. So I'm just going to continue to add all of those little pieces in there and fill everything in. But the trees are not glued in. I'm still going to be able to pop those out and color my sky as one piece, just like I did with my mountain range. So now that I have all of those pieces in place, I've popped my trees out so that I can color the rest of the background and not have to worry about getting ink on them. So I'm using the same 2 marker shades, BG11 and BG10, to color in my snow caps on my mountains. So again, they match with the rest of the snow in the scene. And using that colorless blender, this time I put the color on the bottom edge of the snow, as that's where it would be getting a little bit more melty and icy. For the sky, I wanted to tie in the yellow that I did on the penguin scarves. So I'm using Y000 and Y11. First, I'm just doing a coat of that Y11 because it's so pale, and I just want to get that paper saturated so that the Y11 will really blend in with that once I start to lay that in. And I'm going to do a similar concept to a card that I did not that long ago using some Stacy Yakula images for MFT. That one was in peach tones, and it was a little more swoopy. It had some arcs to the different lines in it. This one is a little more striated. It's got just basically some stripes, so it's kind of resembling, you know, just a different style of cloudy sky. So once I have the Y11 laid in where I want it, I'm going to go back to the Y000 and just blend out the edges of that and kind of get it to soften together. And I will go back and forth a few times, adding those 2 marker colors until I get a look that I'm happy with. And you can see that because I have removed those trees, I'm able to continue those lines straight through, and color right onto that cardstock so that, you know, it doesn't look like I'm skipping around too much, and everything is going to really match up once I get those trees back in place. So now I'm going to add those trees to complete my scene. So I figured the easiest way to do that, considering all of those thin little branches, was to add the glue into that recessed area and then press the trees into place right over top. Now, another tip, if you are worried about coloring the trees once they are in the scene, it actually might even be a little bit easier to do it that way, just so you don't worry about getting any of the markers into, you know, a light colored sky or anything like that. I decided to just go for it, but you could definitely do it off to the side if you were, you know, worried about it. So I'm using C7 to do some little lines on my trees to make them look like birch trees. I love birch trees personally, so any chance that I can get to color them, that's what I mostly prefer, but you could color them in any combo that you wanted. I also thought that the white would look nice with this really frosty scene, and that it would just kind of all fit together. And I apologize for the little dog hair that got stuck to my sticky glue tipped fingers. But now I'm using C5 and just going over the C7 a little bit in certain places, not everywhere, just a few places here and there. And then I'm going to do the same with C3. So once I have all of the detail laid in, I also want to do a bit of shadow to help them kind of lift off the page and bring them a little bit closer to the viewer's eye in the scene. So I'm using C1 for that and just doing quick lines, highlighting all of the little separations between the branches and also the sides of each tree trunk. So this is the part that may be beneficial to color your trees before you glue them in, because it, you know, is a little tricky to not get that color on the background, but if you're careful you can avoid it. So I think either way you'll probably be fine. So now that that scene is completely colored, I'm going to pop it into my MISTI so that I can stamp my sentiment. And because the letters are super delicate in this sentiment, they're just very thin, I'm using VersaFine Onyx Black ink because it's so super crisp that you really only need to stamp it one time. And then I opened up my card. I did have to rearrange my MISTI because the door wouldn't close with the card open with this slimline card size. So I just flipped the spine to the outer edge, and now I'm stamping on the inside of the card using Lawn Fawn's Manatee ink. And I forgot to clean off the other little bear and the sentiment, because they had not been stamped before, so they still had a little residue from the manufacturer. So I just cleaned them off really good with my Lawn Fawn stamp chamois, and then stamped it down a couple more times to make sure I had a nice crisp line. So now I'm ready to begin adhering my images and completing this scene. So I'm going to start with my polar bear that is making the snowball, and I'm going to put him down on the right hand side of the card, kind of overlapping that birch tree a little bit. That's going to help push the scene back even farther in the distance and create a lot of depth. So then I'll have the little penguin next to him kind of dancing around because he's so happy to be playing in the snow with his buddies. And then I've got the other little polar bear, so he's coming to play as well. And then right behind him on the left hand side I'll have my other little penguin. I don't know, this color palette just makes me so happy and totally brings me back to a place of joy in my childhood, and this is totally something that I would have absolutely loved to color as a kid. So now I'm going to finish off my card with some Stardust Stickles. You knew I was going to use it, right? just had to with the snowy, frosty scene. It was the perfect thing to finish things off. And I'm going to use a whole bunch of it. I'm going to add it to the trees on both the sides and also all the little spaces where that snow and ice would collect between the branches. I also added it to the snowball and the snow banks and the snow caps on the mountains. And that is going to complete my card for today. I didn't want to cover up any of the detail on the accessories, so I just left it to the background images. But there you can see how beautiful that looks when it catches the light. And there is another peek of the inside. I had so much fun playing with these images today. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. I post new ones every Monday and Friday. If you're interested in any of the products that I used today, you'll find those listed and linked in the description bar below. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought might also interest you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day. Bye-bye.